We look at blades with hole in them that are not buttlets. Or this is the Kitsune clan, a group of sword enthusiasts who like cosplay, reenactment, and historical martial arts. If you have similar interests, feel welcomed. We today look at some pop culture and other fantasy weapons that have hole in their blades. For a general background of interpreting fantasy weapons, I have linked a video in the description box. So we just saw the sword from Hero, but in fact I have a lot of weapons in our collection where the blade has holes in it. And we want to look at them in more detail. Here we have a dagger from P5. And before we continue to look at it, one important disclaimer. This thing is PU foam, but it can penetrate cardboard and it's hard enough so that pieces break off. What's the hole for? Yep, you can spin it in a cool way around your finger. That was easy, but will not work on the next one. Here we have a fantasy sword I found on Amazon. I don't know from which franchise it is, but it has a hole in the hilt. And I'm not really sure what this should be good for. As you just saw, I tried to use it for drawing the sword. It was not really helpful for that. The way hilt and blade are designed to curve around the hole make it somewhat unusual. We don't really have a functional crossguard or hand protection, which is a downside and not an advantage. Also, the weight distribution is off because there's more material in front of where usually would be the crossguard, making the center of gravity too much into the tip direction. So, although the blade could be considered to look cool, it's not a lot of fun playing with it because without a proper crossguard, tsuba, or comparable type of hand protection, it's tricky to push and really engage in some situations. In a really rare instance, it happens once when we were playing, we could in fact catch the opponent's blade with the hole, but I consider this as extremely unlikely and I don't think it will happen a second time. I also don't think that this was the intention behind the design to trap something with this hole. I'm not sure what the intention could have been, but we just played around a bit and came up with some more weird ideas. Let's have a look in a moment. Maybe we could stick something into the hole. And if I say stick, why not use a stick? And then the sword could turn around the stick. Doesn't that sound really, really useful? Did I just say useful? I meant fun or strange. Or, let's have a look. If I turn the sword really, really fast, I might be able to frighten someone. As long as the sword doesn't stop spinning, right? Unfortunately, it does. And in fact, it does. Easily. Much more easily than starting it again. So I really don't think that was the intention behind it. And I think nobody would think that. Therefore, let's go to the next one. Let's stick another sword through the hole. By this I get a giant cross or a scissor-like looking thing that can catch a blade and effectively disarm the blade of the opponent. Really, really nicely. And afterwards I separate them again and can attack. Useful, or? Yeah, but I could not simply use both swords without sticking one into the other? Well, we have a video on cross-blocking and the mechanical problems of it, linked in the description box, and this hole would solve a lot of the mechanical issues of the cross-block. As we are talking mechanical issues, the sword with the hole in the blade has a kind of a flexible core, and so you can bend the grip out of shape when doing these disarms here. You can also bend it further to a kind of Count Dooku style grip. So if you have been looking for a cosplay sword with a potential type of pistol grip, here it is. But why should you, right? So as stupid as it might look, this cross arrangement pseudo thingy here has consistently produced disarms without any problem. But what you already recognize, even if you just do this simple motion, it's very, very awkward. And if you simply carry that over into free play, it's really something you learn to hate very fast, and you just dissolve this strange cross because then you can really do something. This cross might be stable, but it limits you to a very, very narrow range of possibilities, and you can only properly work if you dissolve the cross. With the cross engaged, you can basically not properly cut or strike. It's very strange to thrust, and also these stabs can be easily blocked, and you can be really, really easily trapped. Trapping one weapon will block the other one as well, so the advantage of two weapons is easily gone. Therefore, it seems not to be a useful thing to do. Overall, that means use for this hole in this blade remains unclear, and it's most likely just a design choice. As this design comes with disadvantages or costs because of the lack of a proper hand protection, I would vote against this design. Next up is one with a hole closer to the tip. If you look closely, this blade has two tips, so kind of a Zülfikar, and it's well known that if you split the tip, it's good to have a hole, but at the base of the split. This hole is somewhere in the middle, which makes it again a bit functionless. Because in this way, the hole does not help to prevent crack lines at the base where the tip is split. Overall, the sword design is not horrible, it's okay. The cross guard is a bit wide and bulky, but the presence of the hole or the separated tips does not come at a high cost. But what about benefits? So there is the idea that split tips could help catching the blade of an opponent. And we really wanted to see whether this is possible, and we tried hard whether there is any chance that you could get the blade of the opponent between the tips. And you know what? It is basically somehow possible. Now, you are fully convinced, or? So the next one of these swords also has a hole in the blade, and it somehow reminds of the grip of a Dusak, although it's a bit tight. But for that we have a solution. You know, fantasy swords are often not scaled right, and they're definitely not scaled for my hand. So, you know already, I have a very useful tool. It's called a box cutter, and that can solve that nicely. Here's the result, a sword that I can use. This hole is now large enough that I can fit my hand in, and that means I can use that sword two-handedly, and I can use the hole for drawing this time. Just saw it. If I grasp the sword at the handle, it's a bit off-weighted. It's a bit like grasping a katana at the bottom of the handle. If I grasp the sword with the lead hand in the hole, it's much better balanced, and I can fit my left hand on the original handle, and both hands are in fact nicely protected. And I think especially the protection thing is something to be noted, because if we look at two-handed swords, often only the lead hand is well protected. This construction here is therefore interesting, and I'm not sure that we have a historical comparable design in any case. Yes, it comes at the cost of range. And that's also something that makes me believe that the design was not originally intended to be used like that, because then the blade could have been significantly longer. When using this hilt construction as a two-handed one, the leverage would definitely allow a much longer blade to be properly and well controlledly used. Therefore, I don't think the hole was thought to be a handle. On the other hand, there is something like a grip material there, so maybe someone had the idea but couldn't think it through. In the one-handed use with one hand at the handle, it's definitely off balance. So back to the two-handed use. If you put your hand into the hole and you have had a butlet in hands before, you somehow feel a similarity, and especially with actions like the Krumpau, it feels somehow familiar. As the butlet is good in half sword, I really wanted to see how this sword behaves, and I also thought maybe the grip could be used to trap the blade of the opponent, like the two prongs of the butlet. And I have to say, it sometimes works, but not reliably. Still, this sword gives a butlet feel and has a butlet look, but you can also fool around with it, like with the other hole in the blade type of swords. What needs to be mentioned, the center of gravity here is different, and you can spin it with much more force. How does it perform when we do scissor against scissor in free fight? Well, of course, as stupid and useless as it was expected to be. This looks simply ridiculous, and that's what it is. In general, now, are holes in the blade somehow useful? Maybe some of them. The thing that reminds a bit of a butlet is definitely interesting. This hilt construction has something to it, and I want to explore that further and also want to check whether there is not a historical equivalent that I have overlooked. In most other cases, the holes will just be design choices. There are other methods if you want to reduce the weight of a weapon, like grooves and ribs and stuff like that. So there's not a reason to put a hole in your blade. As to be expected, not all design features of fantasy weapons have to be functional ones. Some of them are just for fun. Hope we could inspire you. See you around next time.